I am coming to you from Woodbridge, Connecticut. Um, and I'll tell you a little bit about the farm that I've been managing for the last 12 years and some of the practices that we employ for farming with soil life and um, managing our soil ecosystem. So first, I just want to say, this is a picture of some of our crew, and farmers are stewards. We play a key role in soil health management, ecological management, climate restoration, and of course gardeners too. I saw that many of you are gardeners and master gardeners, so this doesn't apply just to farmers. This is, you can do this everywhere and anywhere. We all play a key role here in the soils that we live in and on and around, and there's lots of work to be done. So where we are specifically, here's a little overhead view from courtesy of Google Maps. Just outside of New Haven, just 14 miles from the Long Island Sound. There's it's good to take a look at the watershed that you're in and how the work you do impacts downstream and such. So understanding where we are is important. And here's an overhead view. The Massaro property is 57 acres. You're getting a look at our fields, and then most of the property is woods and wetlands that we do some management of as well. And we're growing on about 10 to 15 acres. So here's a closer up look at the fields that we manage. I do live here on the farm with my family, but it's not my farm. This is a conservation property. The Massaro family was here farming, doing a small dairy with about 25 cows for 2 generations. They sold off 50 acres across the street, and the rest of this 57 acres was put into a conservation easement with the town of Woodbridge. And now we lease that property, and the we is Massaro Community Farm, the nonprofit entity that formed to take over this farm to make sure that it could be an active resource for the community. So this, what we've been doing now for the last 12 years is sort of creating this mission: keep farming, feed people, build community. And the idea was to reclaim and restore and steward this 57-acre property. There hadn't been much activity in the previous 10 to 20 years before we took it on. So we needed to do some restoration, get it up and running. And the idea was to provide organic produce for the greater community. So in New Haven and the Naugatuck Valley. Our first year of production was in 2010. We started off with just 4 acres, offering a CSA subscription for 125 people, families. And by 2019, we had doubled our, more than doubled our acreage and CSA size. We're selling at farmers markets and restaurants in the New Haven area. Last year was shifts for everyone in all sorts of ways. And one of the changes for us with COVID was that we stopped selling to markets and to restaurants. A lot of our restaurant partners closed or shifted. But there was a big boom in interest in the CSA. So we went from 240 to 300 plus, and we had to stop offering sales because there was such an interest. So that was appreciated. That there was that interest in that, which has kept up this year. We're maintaining over 300 subscribers this year. And last year we also created an online store, and we're selling products from our friends' farms who had lost some of their outlets, and created kind of a drive-through, contactless pickup at our farm weekly throughout the spring and early summer. This year we added 200 laying hens. I've always kept a small flock of hens for myself and for some of our neighbors, but we added the 200 laying hens, so we're offer that as an addition to our CSA and for sale. We are certified organic. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and part of our commitment as being a nonprofit is to donate at least 10% of our harvest to hunger relief organizations in the area. And we offer on-farm educational programs and events throughout the year. So that's kind of what's happening here at Massaro. So in terms of our stewardship practices, you've heard about some of them just now. Cover cropping is a key basic. Protecting our soil from erosion and building that organic matter. This was a dairy farm previously, but we don't have livestock farms near us with lots of animals. So we're not adding manure to the fields. Really, we're building up green manure by growing our cover crop, mowing that organic matter and incorporating into the field, feeding that soil biology, those fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates in there. We're using those cover crops as well to attract beneficial insects. So some of them are key flowering species that'll attract natural predators and pollinators throughout the year to our fields. We use them to suppress weeds and invasive species in our fields. Climate change being a big issue, we want to capture that carbon as well and improve our organic matter and keep that number going up for us, which has other benefits, which I'll get into as well, and prevent nutrient leaching. So any additional fertilizers that we do put down to support our crop growth that we maintain by having a really robust soil life and having that organic matter from our cover crops. We do rotate our crops, and that helps balance our nutrients and limit our pest activity, and also try to manage pests when and if we do have any issues. And then in terms of our tillage, one of the slides you saw before was about the sort of scale of tillage. We're kind of a mixed scale, having grown from 4 acres to 10 plus acres. I started off with a tractor and a few pieces of equipment and myself and a few staff. And as we've grown, I've added more pieces of equipment, but we've always tried to keep it as minimal till. And we do have areas that are hand till and no till. So there's kind of mixed modes going on here. We don't use a moldboard plow. We've always used a chisel, which is a little gentler in the soil. And we're not using a rototiller here. I did initially getting things going, converting the fields from pasture and hay into the crops that we're growing. But really, after a couple of years of getting our soils ready, we could eliminate some of those heavier tillage machines to really keep our tillage low, so that we're minimizing our soil disturbance, maintaining and building up our organic matter. And we are on a bit of a hill. We're not at a high elevation. We're at about 480 feet, and we do have some slope in some of our fields, but we need to manage that. And so we need to manage, the direction in which we till, not going up and down the hills, but following our contours, setting up our fields in that fashion, so that when we have these huge rainstorms and hurricanes, that we're not, having soil runoff and soil loss. We need to protect that soil structure and ecosystem through our conservation tillage practices. So I want to talk about cover crops for a little bit, and this is a nice picture of our one of my favorite mixes of peas, vetch, and oats. You can see how lush this is with the broad peas, the tall oats kind of coming in between them, and then I don't think you can see the vetch in here right now. We'll move along and see if we've got it. Well, there'll be some more of the peas, vetch, and oats in a minute. We're going to use cover crops in our fields, at the edges of our fields. And throughout the year, depending on our crop rotation and the crops that we're preparing for, and the crops that have just gone by. So at the edges, I always like to have something flowering, which is often going to be buckwheat or clover mix, or maybe a mix of species. So this is right near the edge. We've got a little drive path on the outside that we mow, and then a flowering path, and then our field. We do grow year round, and we use our unheated high tunnels to grow. And the space in between the tunnels is also productive space, but anytime that's not in production, it's going to be in cover crops. So you can see the crimson or the mammoth red clover here, and the purple is the vetch. So that was sown in the fall, and we didn't have to take any action in the spring to get this lush cover crop and to get these flowering species. And the nice thing about doing that, because we don't have to take any spring action, we don't have to do any cultivation. And these are some of the earliest flowering species in the spring for our pollinators. So here's a look again at those peas, vetch, and oats. So this was from last June, sown in early April, in a field that we weren't going to grow crops on until midsummer. And so actually prior to the peas, vetch, and oats being there, I had a cover crop of buckwheat. The buckwheat winter kills and kind of creates a little brown cover, but it kills at the earliest frost. So once there's a little frost, it's going to die back, and it'll provide some cover, but it's not going to regrow in the spring. So as soon as I was able to get out there, I put down the peas, vetch, and oats, and it's gonna start growing rapidly and get us a big lush cover. With the peas and the vetch, this multi-species of legumes, we're pulling in that nitrogen. We've got both tap roots and fibrous roots, and we're using that above ground space as well with the tall oats, the broad peas, and the vetch vining in between them. So we're really using our above ground and below ground space so that we've got a full canopy, and we've got multiple different flowers of interest for our pollinators. And then here in another field in early July, sown a few weeks later. It's a really great mix, peas, vetch, and oats, for spring and for fall. So I'll sow these in April and May, which then are going to be terminated depending on what's coming next in June or July. It's a simple flail mow, particularly when you're doing these things together. The vetch, being a vine, for those practitioners out there, can get caught in a mower. So you need to be careful about that. But when it's grown up along with the peas and oats, it'll stand up, so it shouldn't get caught in a mower as you're breaking that down. And then depending on what's happening next will depend on the next steps we would take for soil prep for planting. And so this is a sort of a drive path behind our tunnels, but I've selected the species here of mixed grasses and clovers, and at times when they're getting ready to flower, I want to let them flower. I want to have as much life and as many flowering species on the farm as possible. So it's the same with people and their lawns. I encourage, let those lawns grow a little bit, let those clovers flower wherever you can. So we've got a mix of yellow clover here, crimson clover. There's some red clover and New Zealand white clover coming up. There's a little mustard on the side there next to our asparagus is what's tall to the left. And you can see that clover between the tunnels in the distance as well. So one of the things I try to do is keep our pathways in our fields as living wherever possible. So this is a bed where we've used our plastic layer to create a raised bed of plastic, and then we've punched holes in it to plant our zucchini and summer squash. So that's our center row that we're harvesting on. But then I've got what would otherwise potentially be bare paths of bare soil on either side of that bed. But rather than letting that be the case, as soon as we had made those raised beds, I walked down the path sprinkling buckwheat seed in there. Now that buckwheat comes up and is flowering, and if you've seen fields of buckwheat, the bees absolutely love the buckwheat. That's why it's one of my favorite cover crops, because it comes up quick and flowers quick, and the bees love it, and then it also terminates quick. So you can see these squash, they're a nice size, but they're not ready to harvest yet. But as soon as they are, I can walk down there, with a push mower or a push trimmer, or even just drive down the paths and get the cover crop out of our way so that we can be harvesting this regularly. And in the case of a winter squash, we do the same thing. I don't have to do anything all season for this. I've planted, let the winter squash grow. I've let the buckwheat grow. The buckwheat will not interfere with my winter squash crop. It will attract pollinators and natural predators for my crop, and I can let it go to seed. Doesn't bother me at all. And then I'll get sort of a free cover crop after it. Might come up again, and when I harvest the winter squash and clear out the plastic or landscape fabric that we might have been using to grow that in, I've got a free cover crop seed on the ground that'll come back up as soon as conditions allow. So the buckwheat in our paths is something that we really like. Similarly, here's our potatoes growing in the plastic. Lots of lots of people growing potatoes are going to grow in bare soil and then drive through with their hilling discs and cover the potatoes as they grow with soil. And I've taken a different approach here using, in this case, plastic, but I've also started to use some of the certified organic paper mulch that will decompose. And rather than hilling it with soil that I have to keep bare and cultivate, I will come over with my compost spreader and drop leaves on top of it to cover that. So at this stage, you're seeing the row cover on there, and that's helping keep Colorado potato beetle off. So we're doing an exclusion practice here with the physical barrier of the row cover, and some other pests that might attack our potato crop. So we've planted the potatoes through the plastic mulch, sown. In this case, there's a mix of the buckwheat. There's also some oats in that path. And then when the row cover is ready to remove, as it is about here, it's pushing up against there, we'll spread the leaf mulch. We'll take off the row cover, spread that leaf mulch to sort of act like the hilling and encourage more tuber growth. And we can continue to just let that cover crop in the paths be. So we're still maintaining that soil life instead of having a bare path, that then we have to weed or cultivate or encourages weed species to come up. And that's when, again, one of the nice things about buckwheat is it germinates very quickly. And so it'll help outcompete some of the other weeds that might otherwise grow in there. So this is actually from this summer. It's a big summer crop, summer cover crop mix sown in June. And this was from a photo in August. A mix of sorghum, Sudan grass, soybean, Sunn hemp, sunflowers, millet, and buckwheat. So we're getting, flowering species in there of interest. But really the big goal here is organic matter. This is a tremendous amount of organic matter here. It's very dense, it's very lush. When I mow it, I have to go slow. I use a flail mower typically to shred that up. So, and for those of you who might not use these two different kinds of mowers, a flail mower versus a rotary mower. Rotary mowers are typical lawn mower with blade going around, spinning, and sort of injecting to the right, a mass of whatever it cut. And the flail mower is going to be a gang of kind of small blades. It works a little bit more like a blender, turning and spinning and shredding. And so that helps for sort of a better and more even and quicker breakdown for the soil life to feed on. Now, when it's a cover crop as big as this, I'm gonna have to make multiple passes, start off with a high cut and come back with a low cut. When I do that, it also encourages more root growth, and particularly some of the sorghum, Sudan grass, it's got a very significant root mass, and it'll regrow, and I can allow it to do that a couple times. So I don't want it to get so big that I can't mow it at all, but I can mow it, let it regrow, mow it again, and then I have to give time for this to break down before I will be able to plant in there, because I don't want my nutrients to be tied up as I'm trying to grow something else. So the soil is going to work hard to digest that cover crop. So, this is something an area that we'll plant actually some of our garlic, which is going to go in at the end of October, and then overwinter and, harvest next summer. But it's not something that I can follow immediately. So with a planting, so I have to be careful about the cover crop I use and my crop rotation plans for next, for whatever's coming up next. So, this is one of my favorite mixes because it's so much organic matter, but you do have to be strategic about when and where you use this kind of cover crop. And the same would go for winter rye. It's not a crop I use, a cover crop I use a whole lot of, in part because it's such a vigorous grower in the spring. So if you want to be doing a spring or early summer planting and you've got rye growing there, it can be tough to terminate that. And there are strategies, of course, but you've got to get it right. If your planting schedule may need to have some flexibility in it, depending on how the spring and summer goes, if you're going to be following up a winter rye cover crop. So again, I'm talking about how we use our paths to keep them, alive instead of bare. So these are eggplants and peppers. They're going to be in the ground from mid-May until, you know, here in Connecticut and in southern Connecticut, we might be harvesting these into November. So I want to have that ground protected. And all we need to do with these paths is, you know, in the same fashion, we create the beds, sprinkle the seed, a mix of clover and oats, or clover and barley. The clovers are slow to germinate, so the oats or the barley will help nurse that up. I might mix in a little buckwheat in there too, to help nurse that up, because those come up so quick. And then we'll do a mix of mowing and weed whacking along the paths. Now, one of the things that's changed for us is, having grown from 4 acres to 10 plus acres, it's a lot more mowing to do, which sometimes is nice and sometimes is not. So it's another task for us. And there are some cases where, you know, rather than doing the living cover, we'll select to put a weed fabric down in that path, so at least the soil is not bare and we're not encouraging weeds to grow. So we can put, that's about 4 feet between these beds. We can put a 4 foot wide piece of landscape fabric, lay it down, use some fabric staples to punch them in, and that will, you know, keep that soil covered, and you know, keep us from having to cultivate the paths at all and disturb the soil there. So it's a change as we've grown. It was very easy to do that for all of our paths when we were 4 to 5 acres, and as we've grown to 10 plus acres, it's a little more challenging. So I'm a bit selective with where on the farm we're going to do that, and for which crops. But essentially, you know, the long season crops like the eggplants and peppers and tomatoes are the crops that we might do that with. Whereas if this were a crop of lettuce that's only going to be in here for 60 days, you know, I don't want to try to establish a grass that I have to mow for that period. You know, that's where something like a buckwheat might be more appropriate, or putting down the fabric in the path for that short of a time. So I mentioned using the buckwheat early. The nice thing is we can use this all season, starting from, you know, late in April. I mean, you want to get past the first frost, because a frost will kill it. And 2020, we had, you know, in southern Connecticut, we had frosts in around May 10, May 12. That's the latest I've seen it. You know, I know that that's a date that it can happen, so I time my plantings appropriately. But we saw it both in that early May and in mid-September, which is also the earliest I've had it. But we've had some years where we haven't had a frost in April, and we haven't had a frost in even October. So, you know, you have to know your area, and I always try to look out at those 10-day forecasts when I'm planning something, you know, that might be a little fragile or on the edge of its time frame for viability. So, and here's another strategy that we'll use. So this is what it looks like when the frost kills the buckwheat. So that was flowering buckwheat grown that I sort of oversowed in our fall brassicas. So we've got crops of cabbage and kale in this field, and broccoli. I planted those crops into their soil, and then walked along with my spin spreader, spread the buckwheat seed, let it grow up, and the first frost it kills, but it's suppressed the weeds, and it's allowed us to have a cover crop in there at a time where we don't want a competing rye and vetch or peas and oats in with the crops that might impact the development of our cash crop there, of our fall brassicas. The buckwheat really doesn't interfere in that way, and is going to be sensitive to that first frost, and then it's going to provide us the protective layer for the winter, whereas we otherwise might not be able to get that for our late harvested crops. So that's been a nice way to use it. And this is that sort of field where next spring I might put down the peas, vetch, and oats to give us a really lush spring cover before planting again in the summer. So we've got that fall brassica planting, a way to incorporate the covers over sowing the buckwheat, and then coming back in the spring once we're able with the peas, vetch, and oats. So we do have a no-till plot. We've got about an acre that we do without tillage, that we've been doing on as part of a multi-state NOFA project. sharing practices with other farms and farmers, and doing farm visitations, and so that we can experiment together and learn together. So this is the vetch that's growing up from it was in last April, after we sowed in the fall the peas, vetch, and oats. So a different way to look at this cover crop mix is sowing it in the fall, which could be as early as August or as late as the end of September for us. You're not going to get as much growth in October from them if you start then. Although again, every year is different and it's getting warmer later. So, it could be possible, but my target zone for sowing is August to the end of September. So in this case, the peas and oats are going to be very, very lush in the fall. And it's going to take multiple frosts for them to be killed off. And they do that, and they provide that protective mulch layer for the winter. And then in the spring, the vetch grows through it. So the vetch has grown a little bit in the fall, but not much. But then again, without doing anything in the spring, without having to disturb the soil, I get this the vetch growing through that mulch of peas and oats, and I get a very robust cover crop, as soon as conditions allow. I think I've got, so here's that close up. It's dense. It's got a great fibrous root system. It's actually easy to pull up by hand if need be. And you can see those nitrogen nodules when you pull them up, which is fun. And then as it gets warmer, you'll see a nice purple flower, which is a great feed source for our pollinators. So what we did, so this is that same field. So we used the vetch, we let it grow up. I mowed it with the flail mower. I think I actually mowed it twice. I let it grow up again and mowed it again. And then we covered this with silage tarps. So I don't think I got a picture in there with the silage tarp on top of it, but we had a tarp on there for about 7 to 8 weeks. It doesn't need to be on that long. A lot of questions about tarps are how long does it need to be on there? And it really depends what you are covering up. Are you covering the residue from vetch, or from a crop of some greens like lettuce that you harvested, or are you killing off spring rye that you maybe mowed, because that rye really wants to stay there? We've had some side-by-side comparisons on the farm, or near side-by-side in fields, seeing something that we mowed that was the vetch versus what the rye did, tarped for a couple of weeks, and how the rye was still alive under there wanting to go, and the vetch was ready to plant. So for tarps, it really depends on what you've done, and then what you're putting in there next, and what you want that field to look like when you're planting. So you can see here, you can there's just some residue from the killed off vetch on top of the soil, and which can easily be raked off, or in our case, we would use the tine weeder on our tractor. It's very similar. It's basically like the tines from a rake, very light, and only scratches the soil. But in this case, if we wanted to remove that debris, so if we were direct sowing something like carrots or a salad mix, we really can't have the debris because it'll jam the seeders up, or interfere with the seeders going in. But if we were transplanting like a plug in there, we can just plant right into it. So, there might be a little work to do in this case. In this no-till plot, we're not gonna do any kind of major cultivation, but we might just drive in the pathways to help redefine that, or go over with the tine weeder or something light to aerate the soil briefly before planting. And then here's that. So that was mid-July. And then what we did, we had a mix of our fall greens and roots, carrots, radishes, overwinter onions that we plant and then harvest in the next spring, beets, turnips. So this is what that field looked like, and then some row cover to protect from some pests. So pretty simple prep, and minimal soil disturbance to get what would end up being a really healthy crop last fall. So unfortunately, this year in a very similar mode of action in that field, we got some washout in our no-till field from Hurricane Ida, which followed Hurricane Henri. So we got about 8+ inches of rain in between those two storms, almost 10 between the two. I think we got 5 to 6 inches of rain in just a few hours from Hurricane Ida. And What had happened in this field previously was really just what you saw. 1 year later, we had our pea, vetch, and oat cover crop in the spring. And I mowed it, let it grow back, mowed it again, let it grow back, mowed it one more time, put our tarps down. We had it down there for about 6 weeks. And then we saw that Hurricane Henri was coming. So we left the tarps on there. We, made it through that storm, which it looked like it was heading right at us, but thankfully spared us. We got a few inches of rain and a few trees down, but otherwise we were in good shape. We pulled off the tarps and I started my direct sowings of radishes and salad mix. And then a week later, 10 days later, we had a bigger hurricane, which brought us even more rain. And the field actually held up very well. There's just a few spots where we had sort of partial washouts. So encouraging that we've got great organic matter, that this was basically bare soil. I mean, we had it in cover crop all season. We had it in tarps for 6 to 8 weeks. And then we got, those 8 inches of rain in such a short period. Some washouts are inevitable. And what that looked like at the end of the field, there's our soil, that were in those kind of ruts. So, the best laid plans here, and then even monitoring the weather, we can't stop the hurricanes and the things that are going to happen. But while I'm displeased to be looking at this, there's an acre right there or nearly an acre that's in no-till. And that was basically bare from having had the tarps on them. And only a few beds had ruts and washouts, and the soil washed down to the end of the bed. And we're going to shovel some of that back and probably mix it into some low spots in other fields, and or maybe even back into some of those ruts. But we've got to want to recapture that soil. So, but that's what we're up against these days. And in that same storm, we've got erosion in our walkways and paths around the farm. I thought I had a picture of an access road that got washed out as well, but it appears I neglected to put that in. But we've got an access road to our lower field, which is, again, washed out, but still usable to a degree. And thankfully we had repaired that road, or really actually done the work on that road to make it more accessible a few years ago. Otherwise, I don't know that we could get to our lower field of a couple acres where our winter squash is this year. All right, so I wanted to just move on to sort of related pollinator and native plantings. So looking at our field again from up above, we do have honeybees here. We've partnered with the Connecticut Beekeepers Association. They manage our bees. We've got these red lines, our strips of pollinator plantings that we've put that are perennials. And actually we've added more since I made this slide. And there's this 1/4 acre pollinator planting, which we've actually it's changed since then, but the idea is that we're creating these habitats throughout the farm, these and wildlife corridors, so that we're mimicking nature and natural systems. We are on top of a hill. We get wind from the west and the north. We need to control that wind and erosion and create these buffer zones and attract beneficial insects throughout our farm. So the idea is to make the food source continually available and have flowers as early in the season as possible to as late in the season as possible. And so I talked about doing things like buckwheat as soon as we can in the season, but also having these perennials, native trees and shrubs that are also going to flower early and late, so that we're supplying a diversity of food throughout the farm using a mix of species and families. One of the ideas here is having at least 3 species flowering at all times. So we can keep our pollinators healthy. And where to do it is really wherever we can. I mentioned the field and property borders, the ends of your beds and rows, dedicated field rows and inside the crop blocks. There's interplanting that can be done even on our scale at 10 acres, isn't huge, but there's ways to mix that in and really wherever possible. So here's so some of that looks like over 50 species in the 1/4 acre planting that we had done. And have since sort of adjusted as we reshaped some of this land where this is. And it's always fun to see which things the bees are attracted to. I'm going to move a little faster because I'm noticing my time. So pardon me as I scroll a little quicker. So creating these, these are some large trees that we've planted just within the last 10 years, and creating these wildlife corridors, windbreaks throughout the farm. You can see in this picture, not only the windbreak and native shrubs that we've planted here, but this is a swale. We worked with the NRCS to create this water diversion and bring water around a field into our wetlands area, so that we could sort of save this half an acre that we otherwise might not be able to grow in, particularly in wet years where it would be ankle deep water. But now it's a reliable growing field for us. This is a little pollinator strip recently put in of actually eco-type plants. So they're plants that are specific to Connecticut. Their genus and species through a project with Connecticut NOFA and some of the nurseries in the state. Again, right along our drive paths, pollinator strips. Interplanting, again, is really, crops like cabbage, they're going to be spaced, 18 inches apart, 24 inches apart. Putting in a few plugs of dill, letting that flower, or harvesting it is a great way to provide a flowering species, bring in those natural predators and beneficial insects right in with your crop. And what we grow, not a whole lot of herbs. We grow some of the dill and cilantro, and those are some of my favorite crops to just let flower, because the bees absolutely love it and they're all over it. So I know that my early plantings of those herbs don't give me as much as I would like in terms of our harvest, but they're one of the first things that flower on the farm. So I try to get them in with my first plantings in the fields.
Hey, Steve, it's Stephanie. I'm just going to jump in here. We've got, a little bit of wiggle room here with the time. So
okay.
Don't feel like you have to rush through.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I think if we're done by 12, if you're wrapping up around 12:30, then we'll readjust from there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, this is great.
So in the last couple of years, one of my sort of favorite new plants on our farm for both use and pollinators is Tulsi, or holy basil. I call it the pollinator epicenter. It's like air traffic control. It's an airport. There's so much buzzing in and out of that space. It's very easy to grow, and it is wonderfully usable. You might see it, as tea. That's kind of how we use it most. But it's mostly used in South Asia and India, I think, for tea. But you might use it for other cooking stews and soups and such. But people have taken to it here, as part of our CSA, and it's really been great to have, for as early as you can plant basil, so after that first frost, getting out there by mid-May here, and it flowers all season long. It's been really fun. So I definitely recommend that as a garden plant, both for your enjoyment and for seeing how the bees love it. So lots of these things we've done have been in partnership with the NRCS. And so, Stephanie had mentioned that in all the practice codes, which I did not include here, but I wanted to share that, much of the improvements and projects have happened here at Massaro because of our partnerships with the NRCS. And I'm very grateful for the offices and agents that we've worked with here. Really phenomenal people who I've talked to share the issues and have helped come up with plans. So, and one of the first things when I took on this job to manage the farm was starting with the forest management plan. Generally my focus is the acres where we're producing the crops. We have 30 plus acres of woods and wetlands, and we need to manage some of that as well. And it's not part of my daily routine, but some basics, dealing with some of the invasive species out there and how it's going to fit in with our overall plan for the farm. It's really helpful to get that on the books right away. We have always been certified organic, but it took us a year or two to do the process, and we were able to do a transition to organic program with the NRCS. So things that we were planning to do, cover crop rotation and nutrient management, we could receive some funding for and some consultation about. So that was really helpful. Deer exclusion fencing. We've got our own woods and neighboring state forest If we didn't have deer exclusion fencing, we probably wouldn't have vegetables for people. So they've helped put that up. We have, as is shown, established trees and shrubs, pollinator habitat, wildlife habitat, and corridors. We've put up high tunnels for season extension. We've put in one water diversion and grass waterway or swale. We're about to put in another one. I've helped with irrigation management, really putting in or helping cost sharing on the drip irrigation. Wherever we drive, there's going to be issues with erosion control. So we've worked on access road to designs and tractor crossings and cost sharing for all that, and various erosion control and brush control and mulching projects throughout the farm. So I'm always encouraging other farmers to look out for these programs and talk to their agents, because these programs are have really helped us grow our farm and keep it a healthy environment, and address some of the issues, mainly with water and erosion control issues and access and such. So, we partnered with other partners too. We want to reduce our carbon footprint. This is a little bit of a side, but the key partnerships can make this happen. So, there's some programs with the state and with our town, and some public-private partnerships. We've been able to, put solar panels all over our barn. We've also worked with the State Department of Agriculture, the Farm Viability Grant, and now we've got 200 laying hens, on pasture in a mobile coop. Working on these 4 acres that are, rockier than the rest of our very rocky farm, but it's a great place, for pasture. And so we're moving 200 hens through that, where they move every few days in this mobile coop. They've got a solar powered coop that does automated feeding and watering, timing with a timer to open and close their coop. We check on them a couple times a day, collect eggs, refill their food and water as needed. And bring in eggs for our CSA. So we're now offering, that additional product and helping restore and reclaim the acres that they're on, which was pretty wild with invasive species when I arrived. We've mowed that back, and now we're trying to establish some more trees and shrubs and create little plots that we can grow on in there as we move the chickens around. So I think one of the things I'm always concerned about is just our local and regional and global ecosystems, and farms and farmers are key to growing our food and fiber. We don't move the needle that much as a 10-acre farm, but we've got 300 plus families coming to us for food on a weekly basis, June through October. And I think there's lots of farms like us out there, and we play an important role. So having partners help us be better stewards is really key. I thought I had one more at the end of there, but it just took me to the end. So maybe I didn't have as many as I thought. How are we doing there, Stephanie?
That's great. Yeah, fantastic, Steve. I think, let's see, there's a few questions here in the Q&A. One was about chickens and the jumping worms. If there's kind of a way that the chickens could feed on those and help manage them. Maybe Steve, you could talk about what you see your chickens eating, and Jennifer could chime in on that one too.
Yeah, I mean, the chickens certainly eat worms, and the jumping worm is new to me. So I'm actually, I'm interested to know more, but I don't doubt that they would eat, or at least try to eat them. So, and then it's a matter of, can you put the chickens where they are, but they scratch, we keep them, we've got 2 100-foot strands of electric fencing that they're in, that kind of makes up their pen. So you can make a square or rectangle of any size. They're going to eat down whatever's in there, and then they're going to start scratching and start getting at, some of those worms and such. When I always like to feed them, our pests as well. So if we've got leaf miner in our chard and we pull that out, I want to feed that to the chickens. So, I rely on them to eat some of the pests, but I can't speak specifically to their habit on the jumping worm. So I would defer.
Thanks. Jennifer, do you have anything you want to add at this moment?
Yeah, I'll just add, it sounds like that they're not preferred food for chickens. They'll try them out, but don't love them. Also, apparently they do accumulate some heavy metals in their body. So that's a consideration for feeding them directly to chickens. You know, it probably isn't a huge deal for them to eat a couple, but if you were to gather jumping worms and then feed them, that would probably be a lot of heavy metals that they would accumulate in your body, which could be a concern in their body, chicken bodies, if that would be a concern if they went on to become people food.
Yeah, that could be important. So thanks for mentioning that, Jennifer. Steve, there was a request. Someone was asking if you could go back to the slide where you talked about the plot with common crops like radishes were planted and the cover that you used with that one. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, let me see. So,
okay.
I don't think this is it, but I'll start on this. This was the cropped cabbage and dill, and then we had the picture of let's see. This was our washout of some of the radishes, and there's also some. They're all sort of same family. This brassicas. They're going to look similar growing up there of arugula, salad mix, radishes, and such. And then this might be it too. Let me, pull that up. So we've got carrots growing in the near. It's probably there's some paper pot onions next to it that were grown over winter. Some more paper pot onions, then more carrots, and then there's a mix of radishes and more. Probably under the row cover is going to be a lot of the brassicas. We're going to protect them from flea beetles in the fall, particularly. So it's going to be a mix of the brassicas in there, whereas the onions and carrots aren't a concern for those pests.
Okay, great. Yeah, this is the slide that was desired, the one we were looking for. And I don't know, the question was about cover, and maybe they mean the row covers. So could you just kind of describe maybe a little bit more about what material they are or where you're sourcing those from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that row cover, row cover is your sort of generic term, or floating row cover. Sometimes people will call them a frost blanket. So they vary in weights. So you might have a very lightweight row cover that's really will provide minimal frost protection or temperature control or minimal greenhouse effect, minimal warming, but have plenty of insect protection. So sometimes the lightest weights are also called insect barriers. So we're trying to create that physical barrier to keep off whatever it is. Earlier I showed the potato leafhopper or Colorado potato beetle on the potatoes. And for the brassicas, our main pest and our most annoying pest on the farm is the flea beetle for our brassica crops. There's not really an organic solution to that. In terms of if you're spraying something, and we do almost no spraying of anything anyway. So, I'll use Surround, which is a kaolin clay. So it's like, I describe it as if I put clay on your food, you might not want to eat it anymore. And when I put clay on the leafy greens, the bugs don't want to eat it so much either. So that's something that we do at transplant. And it's not a pesticide, it's a deterrent, but the physical barrier is even better. So if we can keep the pests off of there with this physical barrier, and in the fall, a heavier weight will also keep it warmer to keep that soil temperature up, to keep them growing so that we can extend our season. So this is not in our high tunnel, but these crops are cold hardy. And by just giving it the few degrees of protection with a medium weight row cover, we can encourage some additional growth late in the season for things that we're planting from now into mid and late October.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, that was a great overview of the row covers or the insect barriers. I guess while you're on the subject of pests, there was one just asking about what cover crops, if any, become persistent weeds.
I've heard people say that about buckwheat, and I don't buy into it as a persistent weed. It will go to seed, and you can see it go from its white flower to its dark seed, and you can decide to terminate it before then or not. But buckwheat would be like the best weed I ever had if that was the weed, because it's easy to remove. I can pull all of it out by hand. You can mow it, you can hit it with a weed whacker, and it's gone. And it doesn't regrow from its root in the way that a grass goes. So, and if it does come up and you wanted something there, you can terminate it pretty quick. A couple of days tarp or a silage tarp, or you're doing a cultivation, a quick cultivation, and you're ready for something else. So people have said that about buckwheat, but I'm not sure why. I'm not sure what the issue there would be. So anyway, for a long time. Rye is the one, rye is not going to be a weed, but it's the thing that it gets in the way in the spring. If you don't terminate it exactly when it needs to be terminated, it can be a problem. And if you need to terminate it before it gets to that sort of full sort of peak of heading, you can have a problem. And then also after that, it still takes time for the soil to digest that. And the roots are very strong. And I don't know that it's actually allelopathic, which would mean that it's having some exudates that compete and keep other things from growing. But I've heard people say that. I can't say that for sure, but regardless, the idea is that it doesn't allow you to grow something immediately thereafter. You need to allow for time. But and I've been happy to see vetch. I wouldn't call it a weed, but I like to see that it's out and about on the farm in places where I didn't recently plant it. So, but again, easy to pull out by hand, has a flowering interest to pollinators. So weeds are typically things that we call problems and things that we don't want. And any of the cover crops that I use don't fall into that.
Great. Related is a question of, would you recommend cover crops for raised beds?
I would recommend some and not others. So peas and oats are a great one. Again, rye is the one that, because it stands out in people's mind as something that they can use and they know about, and also because you can put it in late in the season. So maybe I should give the one plug for rye, is that it's one of the few things that you can do, at least here in the Northeast, late in the season. So you've got, your garden beds are full right now, you clear them out in another 6 weeks and you're thinking, what can I put in to grow to create that soil life? That thing is rye, which isn't going to grow much. You might only see an inch of growth. But in the late fall and early winter, you'll see vigorous growth in the spring, and that's where the problem is now, if you wanted to plant that raised bed again, you need some time to mow that, tarp that, let things digest, so it doesn't get in the way of your spring growth. Now, you might be able to rip it all out by the roots, or get under it with a spade and put that to your compost pile. There are ways to do it. It's just challenging. So I'm more likely to recommend for that late fall season to cover your bed with leaf mulch, and then remove that leaf mulch in the spring and plant something else. But the peas and oats are a really great, easy to do combo. You don't need to have the vetch in there, but if you do, it's nice to have that extra legume and some additional growth in there. Buckwheat is a really easy one. There are things like millets. Clovers are nice for pathways, not as nice for beds if you're in a raised bed. So I don't really recommend clovers in the bed, but I would recommend them around your beds and in pathways, because they're walkable, they stay low, and you can mix those with things. You could put your rye there around your beds too. It's mowable along with the clover and something else.
Yeah, fantastic. Let's see, there's another question in the Q&A. Do you see less vegetation pests, so herbivores, since there's a healthy and diverse selection of native predators?
Yeah, I mean, there are pests. I think we see not so many pests. The two persistent ones for us are flea beetles and leaf miners. The leaf miners, I created my own problem with high tunnels by season extension, by growing spinach and chard in the high tunnels, allowing the leaf miner to have like an extra generation in the year by creating a warm space and providing it food. So that's become a problem for us, but and now it's changed. I don't grow as much spinach anymore. We often can grow a good beet, but might have to take off the tops. Our chard isn't as clean as I would like. I see a lot of life out there. We've got all the bees and butterflies that we can imagine, grasshoppers and crickets and things. We have to manage those too, or they'll eat your crops. So be careful, don't let the grass get too high around them. I've been very happy with our pest management, and the levels of loss. There's just going to be something here and there, but it's not something I stress about.
Okay, I think that for now has gotten us through the questions. Just if you have a chance, Steve, there's some nice compliments about your presentation in both the chat and the Q&A. So I'm just glad to hear about that. And yeah, hope that what we presented here today is helpful. Oh, we got a new one. Here's for you, Steve. How do you maintain soil health in high tunnels?
Oh, it's a good question. So we do use cover crops in the high tunnels, not as, I don't want to say not as frequently, but it's more likely in the high tunnels that we might finish a crop, terminate that crop. It might be in the same way, depending on what it is. We might, mow that vegetation down, cover it with a tarp, pull it back up. So we're going to add more compost in there, and we make compost from two sources on our farm. We collect leaf mulch from landscapers in the area, which in about 18 months turns into a really nice compost for us. And then we have our own vegetative matter. So we're going to add compost in there, and in terms of fertility, we're going to add alfalfa meal is one of my favorite fertilizer sources for our tunnels. Now that we have the chickens, actually, the chickens are going to overwinter in our high tunnels as well, although probably one at a time. There's issues with manure management and such. And one of the things that can come up if you've heard about dangers in your tunnel is about salt buildup. And that usually has to do with using animal manure in there and then the soil not being able to flush that out because it's been covered. It hasn't been rained on. And those salt levels will build up, which can be a problem. We haven't had, until now this year, we have more chickens, we haven't had animals in there, but part of that strategy is going to be after the chickens are gone, not to plant right into that. We need to have a 90 to 120 day interval between a harvest and when you last had sort of live manure there. That's depending on your crop. So there's going to be a cover crop in between there, which is going to help reduce that. And also we can pull, since we don't have a crop that needs the protection of the high tunnel, we can take the plastic off, let it be rained on, which this year would have been 20 inches of rain this summer. Last year would have been 0.
A washed out high tunnel.
Yeah. But we also do have the ability in all of our tunnels to do drip irrigation or overhead irrigation. So you can, if you for some reason had a salt buildup, it is something I'm tracking. I take soil tests every year, but that's not been an issue. But you could mimic the flushing by rain by using overhead irrigation, and doing that with a cover crop growing is going to be even better. So the fertility management is going to be dependent on the crop. So the tomatoes that I'm growing in the summer, we're asking a lot of. They're much more than even field tomatoes. So we need to give it fertility. We need to have it well prepped. Whereas the lettuce or spinach that I'm growing over winter are not heavy feeders. So I don't need to prep them in the same way or add the same level of fertilizer or compost. So it really depends on what the crop is, what's been there before, and what's going to happen now. But we do use cover crops in them. We do similar tactics of mowing, tarping, and creating beds in the same way we do in the field, but it's all on hand scale. We'll use our we do have a BCS, a walk behind tractor. We'll use hand tools, spades and forks and shovels and rakes to make our beds in there. So it's light work in there, and basically a no-till or very light till in and around our tunnels.
Mm-hmm. And I guess with some of that, like integrating the chickens or using the cover crops, are you kind of always putting tomatoes back in the same high tunnel, or are you also rotating the
we're rotating the crop. So we have, again, thanks to the NRCS programs, we have 5 30 by 96s. I could go back maybe to an overview, but we usually have tomatoes in 2 tunnels. So we've got 5 30 by 96s, 1 30 by 48, and we've just built 2 what they're calling caterpillar tunnels that are 14 by 100. So we're able to rotate the tomatoes so they're not in the same ones every year.
Okay, fantastic.